Friends, there's something special about a small town newspaper. Thanks to the internet, I can catch up on the news online from my hometown and also two of the communities that we served in South Dakota and in Iowa. But I've also been blessed with a weekly subscription to the Minden Courier. That's been given to us by two friends in Minden, Nebraska each Christmas time. So each week I go with anticipation to my mailbox to get a copy of this newspaper. I can keep up with families I knew when we lived there. I can share their sadnesses and their celebrations. I can keep up with the high school sports teams. You can open up to the second page and I can even see who got speeding tickets. Whose house was patrolman was called to because the dog was barking. At 10:16 on the 9th of September, an officer was conducting a traffic stop at 5th and Brown, and the driver was given a verbal warning for no headlights. You know, all sorts of wonderful things that you want to know about what's going on in that community. Small town newspapers are special that way. But maybe my favorite part of the paper is that section that takes a look back at what happened, 10, 20, 30 years ago. In this paper, it's called Do You Remember? And it goes all the way back here to 1937. But when I check out that section, I check what took place in the paper maybe 20 years ago, because that's when we were part of those communities in South Dakota and in Nebraska. And I'm amazed at the number of names that I no longer know or recognize, but I'm especially amazed at the events that I've forgotten. And it's only been 20 or 30 years in such a relatively short period of time, and already we're fading from the story of life in those small towns. Now, with that in mind, I want to lift up a verse from the scripture story that sets the stage for the readings that you just heard this morning. As we moved through Genesis in September, we saw God's story acted out in creation, in the promise of God to Abraham through his descendants Isaac and Jacob. And we spent a few weeks over the summertime looking at the story of Joseph and how the people of Israel settled in Egypt in the first place. And as that story of Genesis comes to a close, God's people were in a pretty good place. They were safe and they enjoyed a good relationship with their Egyptian neighbors because of Joseph. And then Joseph died, and time passed. And we turn the page to Exodus, and in the first chapter we read this. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And it's written with kind of an ominous tone with what might happen next. Scholars estimate that about 400 years have passed between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And that's not a whole long period of time as far as Bible history goes, but how many of you can recall very much about what was going on in the Western civilization in the 1600s? Can you name an event? Jamestown was settled. That's one. Other things took place that were earth-shaking, earth-changing, but we can't remember them now. The Pharaoh ruling 400 years after the Pharaoh of Joseph's time did not remember that Joseph had saved Egypt from a famine. He didn't remember that Joseph had risen in the ranks to rule as Pharaoh's second in command. He didn't know that the Israelites were God's chosen people. He didn't know that his reign over God's people would soon come to an end. He didn't know the story. Over that period of 400 years, the Egyptians had slowly and methodically enslaved the Israelites. And the Israelites did not know that God had heard their cries. They had no idea that their lives were about to change forever, because they didn't remember the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they had no idea of what their God was about to accomplish. And into that time in the story, Moses was born. One of God's chosen who grew up in Pharaoh's household as a son. He was in the perfect position to be the one who would lead God's people to freedom. But he didn't know the story either. He only knew that by birth, he was one of the slaves and was driven from his privileged position, exiled from Egypt because he killed an overseer who had beaten one of his people. But he didn't know the story, and he didn't know this God of Israel when this strange sight of a burning bush caught his attention. He didn't know the story, but he was about to learn. As you hear this story, it seems like the only one who remembers is God. The only one who knows the story is God. And it isn't that the one thing that makes any story of faith memorable and trustworthy? The fact that God remembers, that God is faithful. Look again at the story. Only God could have brought these events and this people together. The Exodus event was the first time that God claimed an entire nation as God's own. Until now, God had claimed individuals and families, and a promise had been made that all nations would come to know God through them. But this was the first time that the entire nation is called the people of God. And God had a plan. And that plan was part of the story that Moses was sent to tell Pharaoh and God's people in Egypt. It's a story based on faith in a faithful God. I am is God's name. I am there, and I love you. You are mine. Remember that. That is the foundation of your story as children of God. God is. You may have forgotten God, but God remembers you. God is. The faith story is also about God who just does not exist, but God who does things. God calls Moses to tell the story of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is about to do a miraculous thing. He's about to free an entire nation of slaves and deliver on a promise that's over 400 years old. A promise that God's people had forgotten. It's a pretty good thing that God had a long memory. That's the story, the plan that God gives Moses to tell the people. And notice that this is a team effort. God works through people that God calls to tell the story. And the story tells us that Moses wasn't real anxious to be the one to tell the story, the one to roll out God's plan. Doesn't that sound like us? None of us are real anxious to tell the story, even though we might sing with gusto, I love to tell the story. Not many of us, like Moses, feel like we're up to the task, or that we know the story well enough to tell it to somebody else. But God tells Moses, and God tells you and me to remember just one thing. We're not alone. God is with us, and we are part of the story that God calls us to share. Go, he says, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you are to speak. When I look at the Do You Remember section in those small town newspapers, it's always exciting to come across an event that I remember, or an event that I took part in. It's really exciting when I see my name in that paper as one who was remembered at that time. The story comes alive for me again. This story that we find in Scripture is your story. And you can find your name as a child of God written all over its pages. God invites us to learn that story and learn it well. Remember, that story is all about God walking with you, being faithful, calling you chosen and loved. And then God calls us to go and tell your story. Would you pray with me? Lord our God, we love the story we hold in our hearts. Now help us to move that story from our hearts into our minds, into our voices, into the lives that we live. That we can take that story out into the world that needs to hear of your love and your plan and your call to the world. Speak to us, speak through us, we pray.